If the moral calculus of rising up and rising down is valuable at all, it should be practical. Specifically, it should help us analyze almost any sort of violence one can imagine into its component excuses, analyze the excuses for justifiability, then leave us to the exercise of weighing those competing justifications according to our own predispositions. I believe that the acts of murder committed on September 11th were unjustifiable, evil, wrong. The great majority of people I met in Yemen a year later considered them justifiable. How can we build an empathetic bridge between us and them? Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. As always, we are talking about the final volume, volume 6 in William T. Vollmann's Rising Up and Rising Down. What a journey it has been. This volume continues from the previous volume with its studies in consequences. We're now moving to the Muslim world, North America, and South America. In South America, specifically Colombia, as it embodied the bulk of what Vollmann was focused on at the time. The Muslim world encompasses Somalia, Malaysia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen. And I have to say, this is probably the most powerful portion of the book. I haven't thought about September 11th in a while, but I am of the generation who has two defining moments. We can all say exactly where we were and what we were doing on two occasions. One, in April 1999, when the students and gym teacher at Columbine in Littleton, Colorado were massacred. And the second one is September 11th, 2001. Always intrepid, always putting himself in harm's way and right on the brink of death, or at least violent abuse at the end of malevolent hands. William T. Vollmann is just jaunting around in Yemen and Somalia and so on, and trying to get close to people and talk about Osama bin Laden and the Americans and George Bush. And it's just unbelievable what he has done for us. And as he has in other places of the world, he gets closer to people than any other journalist has. He's also so objective, yet subjective. And the only way I can explain that is, as I've said before, he's constantly playing devil's advocate, even against himself. And I realized that what he does a lot in his journalism, of which this volume, again, like the previous volume, is made up of his essays, many of which were rejected originally for publication intended and now included here in all their glory. And you'll see why they were rejected. And he footnotes a couple of things in particular. But I realized that what he uses in his journalism is Rappaport's rules. In Daniel Dennett's book, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking, which I keep on my desk at work or at home now, which is where my work is. Daniel Dennett does a great job breaking down Rappaport's rules for debate and criticism of other people's views. And he says this is how you compose a successful critical commentary. And this is exactly what Vollmann does. Number one, you should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that your target says, "Thanks, I wish I'd thought of putting it that way." So showing that you understand what the person is saying. Number two, you should list any points of agreement, especially if they are not matters of general or widespread agreement. Again, Vollmann excels at that. Number three, you should mention anything you have learned from your target. Again, Vollmann excels. And number four, only then are you permitted to say as much as a word of rebuttal or criticism. And you'll see this again and again. The two lengthy essays with their hands on their hearts, which is on Afghanistan, and then Off the Grid, which is a lengthy but amazing compilation of voices chiefly from Idaho and around the Ruby Ridge Massacre and Beau Grits and gun control is the predominant theme. It's almost like an oral history. The other two big pieces in here that I liked were the one piece on the guardian angels, which I had heard about. I think I saw a reference to it on a documentary a while back or something, but I never really knew about what they did. But this was basically just a vigilante justice, purportedly without violence, definitely without any weapons, though many of them were trained in martial arts. But in the 80s, I think, this group started in New York City, I believe, called the Guardian Angels. And because the police were failing to keep people safe on subways and parks at night and stuff like this, they took it upon themselves to voluntarily go out on the streets and protect people. And the leader was a very eccentric person. Some of his views, of course, did not sit well. And Vollmann, just as Vollmann can, he got in there, spent time with them on the streets, spent time with law enforcement, spent time with lawyers, spent time with other government officials, and just trying to collect and understand all the different points of view. And only then inserting his criticism, Rappaport's rules again. He also, of course, went down to Jamaica. Yeah, man. Irie, man. Jamaica, me crazy, man. Slappa the bass. He was, of course, running around with all these different Jamaican gangs, almost killed over and over, put his life on the line to get this one picture, of which he humorously says it was not worth it after when he looked back on it. His reportage on Columbine is particularly impactful in this volume. Some highlights. He talks about parts of Mao Zedong's handbook on guerrilla warfare. And I just imagine to myself, I just keep thinking about Vollmann's personal library. Yes, he goes to different public libraries, university libraries, and so on, and does research. But he often mentions, his Encyclopedia Britannica, his now out of print and illegal anarchist's handbook. And I can't imagine what it would be like to just peruse his personal library. He has this self-deprecating humor that never gets old because he uses it sparingly. At one point, he says, "Most of the time, I sat looking stupid. It was a great life." He gives us all these nuggets, such as in Asia, teachers are respected and their opinions are as gold, kind of contra the West and the US in particular. He talks a lot about self-reliance and individualism in America and in many different lights. There's a lot, again, as with the entire thrust of this work. He's just constantly giving variations on that theme of us versus them. He says, "A lawyer lives next door to me in California, an older, very kind, wise, soft-spoken man. I asked him whether in his career he'd ever met somebody who came out and said, 'The other side is right, I'm in the wrong.' The lawyer smiled and scratched his chin. 'No, Bill,' he said, 'I don't think I've ever run into that.' Unfortunate, but true." He introduces Osama bin Laden in a way that completely caught me off guard. Again, Vollmann shining a light on lots of areas of my ignorance. He says, "En route to Jalalabad, passing a depot of camels on a chalk-pale rise, my taxi driver pointed out a squat, striated hill from which a certain mujahid, armed and funded by the United States of America, had fought bravely and well against the Soviet tanks. The name of that hero was Osama bin Laden." He always has these pithy asides that just reach out and just cut. One of them goes, "Soldiers, like other pets, are expensive to keep." Again, as with a previous volume where we get this visualization of Vollmann after a day of putting himself in all kinds of peril and, not exhausted and just passing out on his bed, but reading Dostoevsky's The Idiot. Well, in this one, he says, "Laying down my Quran, I read a chapter of Don Quixote." And reading Don Quixote seems just perfect for everything that's going on. The idealist wandering around war-torn Afghanistan. Self-reliance is indeed the name of the North American game. The price we pay is one Columbine after another. And he footnoted that. So I wanted to go look at that footnote, and sure enough, the footnote comes from a friend of his who is in the NRA and said, well, Columbines are pretty rare, actually. Now, we have to remember this book is being finalized in 2003, and it's a shame to see how many school shootings have happened since then. He says that a month after the tragedy, when I finally wrapped up this essay so that I could get paid, It got rejected, so I never did. So again, he does so much work and sheds so much light in this piece on Columbine, but yet it gets rejected. One feels by the time you're done reading the unexpurgated version included in Rising Up and Rising Down, one feels certainly that it's because he just turned over stones that people would much rather leave unupended. This is from the Guardian Angels essay. At one point, Sliwa, who is a guardian angel, the founder, I believe, made a very profound and disconcerting remark. He said, "The people in America who talk about people's rights to express themselves, even in negative ways, are affluent and protected." And Vollmann says, "Here I myself stand accused and convicted." If we think back to an earlier volume, Vollmann made a bold statement about artistic expression, freedom of speech, even if it's just of the most heinous and hate-filled kind. He still stands behind it, but this guardian angel is challenging that. And Vollmann goes on to say, "I do not live in a red light district anymore. If I did, I believe that the viciousness associated in America with illegal drugs and illegal vaginas would grate on me. I would want those sad, addicted street women and their pimps to let me walk home from the late night movie in peace. But as I know from Asia, prostitution itself does not have to be that way. It is the shame we attach to it that makes it that way. Legalized, controlled, regulated, and taxed, it could enhance local," and I think that's a misprint. I think it's supposed to say enhance social life instead of degrade it. Like I said, this flies in the face of his bold statement on artistic expression, but it also shows an area, once again, Vollmann's just kind of obsessed with the area of prostitution and so on. Some of his views just really grate on people. He kind of even goes back to drugs, the divide between people who believe in the DEA and the ATF and, the war on drugs. Vollmann has spoken about how you can't really have a war on drugs. These are chemicals and, you can't fight against chemicals. As is happening with marijuana, as it's getting legalized and taxed and controlled. It's a really, really sticky topic. And it all comes back to that argument that, well, no matter what, people are going to do it. So what's the best we can make of it? He also has very unpopular views on gun control. It occurred to me that it's really hard to even pin down what party he would go for. And you realize in one of these essays, he just straight says it. He doesn't believe in politics as it is now. Concomitantly with his views on prostitution, we have this on gun culture, as he calls it. "The American gun culture is probably doomed, and I stand among the mourners. Let me lay down all my cards. I do not belong to the National Rifle Association. In fact, I am not a card-carrying member of any organization except for the Social Security swarm and such like compulsory herds. Of my 6 guns, each of which was purchased according to all the official mummeries, only 2 have not yet been outlawed. Regarding such issues, I imagine that this essay will neither convince the opposed nor flatter the converted. And that's just as well, for most political arguments are boring or repulsive, in part on account of the anger expressed on both sides of the debate." And the thing is, as I hope that conveyed to you as it did me, despite his stance on things where he does give you in black and white his belief on it, he's just so honest and so open, and he's just like Ralph Emerson's all-seeing eyeball that you can't help but continue to listen and consider even after he has just offended you. And there's a reason why, and he puts it in plain speech. He says, "In short, the golden rule and self-preservation jointly require that we examine the justifiability of all our opponents' arguments, even after one of them has been proven resoundingly invalid." That is a difficult but necessary admonishment, and I find myself thoroughly challenged by that because I have many times been guilty of not examining the justifiability of my opponent's arguments after I've found one of their arguments to be resoundingly invalid, as Vollmann puts it. Wow. It gets at that mode and approach of examining the entire landscape instead of that sort of drive toward micro history or micro criticism, where we seize on that one grain of salt to tell a story and to take a stance. Because after all, taking a stance, telling a story, criticizing events, offering an opinion, it's all a form of interpretation. And as Vollmann in another of his short, pithy statements says, to interpret is to control. When is violence justified? If this ponderous book has accomplished anything at all, I hope that it was at least shown that even the clearest theoretical justifications require referencing and dissection. The fat of a spurious invocation of creed must be scraped away for us to see that this excuse for murder really equals nothing but expediency. And the blood-red pulsations of an appeal to racial self-defense need to be tested for the presence or absence of simple reasonableness in the racial identity being protected. Defense of homeland cannot be judged completely without consideration of ethos. Defense of Earth seems to require the special category of scientific eminence, and so it goes. And I think that's a great closing statement. And I think that final phrase, so it goes, I believe that's a refrain from Slaughterhouse-Five, and surely Vollmann intended that. To wrap up this series on reading through the unabridged Rising Up and Rising Down, I want to just offer 10 things that I've learned from reading unabridged Rising Up and Rising Down. Number 1, we are all moral actors in the same play. Number 2, my foundation for many of my moral judgments and my system of ethics as pertains to justification of violence was feeble, and still really is feeble at best. Number 3, some of my ethics were inherited unconsciously and left hitherto uncontested. Number 4, I don't know nearly as much about the world as I thought I did. Number 5, I could spend the rest of my life reading just the sources Vollmann read for this study. Number 6, my notion of the limits of freedom of speech and artistic expression wasn't as certain as I thought. Number 7, Vollmann genuinely cares for the entirety of humanity in its many, many forms. Number 8, expediency is a terribly ordinary thing in the history of violence. Number 9, clemency is an act fraught with political ulterior motives. And number 10, John Brown was a white man who used violence to battle racism. Martin Luther King Jr. was a black man who used pacifism to diffuse racism. Both were killed for it.